Doc, great, there we go. On behalf of my colleague, Dr. Müge Finkel, who is the director of the Ford Institute for Human Security, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our first speaker for this year's Diversity Speaker Series. This series is jointly hosted by the Ford Institute and the Ridgway Center. Our goal in this series is to highlight the perspectives and research of a diverse range of scholars in international affairs so that we may learn from their expertise and their experience. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs here at Pitt, as well as the University Center for International Studies. So thank you for your support. The focus of our diversity series this semester is gender and world politics. I can't think of a better scholar to feature than Dr. Laura Sjoberg. Dr. Sjoberg is British Academy Global Professor of Politics and International Relations at Royal Holloway University of London, where she is also the director of the Gender Institute. So Dr. Sjoberg is actually piping in across the pond, and we're just absolutely delighted to have her with us today. She specializes in gender, international relations, and international security, and has done substantial work on war theory and women's political violence. Dr. Sjoberg is a prolific scholar, and her research has been published in more than 4 journals, political science, international relations, gender, and many other areas. She is the author or editor of 15 books, including most recently with Jessica Peet, Gender and Civilian Victimization, a second recent book with Sammy Barkin, International Relations Last Synthesis. She's also the author of this book, which I have on my bookshelf, Gendering Global Conflict Toward a Feminist Theory of War. The title of Dr. Sjoberg's talk for us today is There Is No Feminist Peace, a pessimistic view of gender and the war system in times of crisis. After Dr. Sjoberg's presentation, we will open it up for Q&A. So as you're listening, jot down any questions you might like to ask. Dr. Finkel is graciously agreed to help me moderate the Q&A portion. Please be ready to type your questions into the Q&A feature on Zoom when you want to submit your question. We look forward to a lively discussion. So without further ado, happy to turn it over to you, Dr. Sjoberg. Thank you again for joining us. It's great to have you.
Well, thank you for having me. I think, all right, I'm going to successfully screen share, hopefully. Okay. If I was really cool, I would know how to do that without showing the slides first, but I'm not cool. So the title of this talk, as the generous introduction said, is There Is No Feminist Peace. And the idea is to kind of communicate a pessimistic view of gender and the war system in times of crisis. So I put the feminist piece in quotes because it's a term that's used pretty frequently, not only in the academic literature, but also sometimes in the public discourse about gender, war, and peace. And so the claim I'm particularly interested in is a very small subset of the theorizing and relationships between gender and peace. And it's the argument that when you increase gender equality in a state, you make that state less likely to become involved in armed conflict with other states. So the feminist piece is a term like the democratic peace or the McDonald's peace or something like that, which suggests that a particular characteristic of a state when shared with another state makes it less likely to become embroiled in conflict. And the argument that I'm making is that is not the case. And when you start thinking about gender in more complex ways, you might understand why it's not the case. So I'm going to see if in a few minutes I can convince you of that particular stream of argumentation. Particularly when I say there is no feminist peace, I mean it in three ways. First, I mean that claims to the empirical evidence for the existence of a feminist peace are themselves suspect upon close examination. Second, I mean that the political implications of making a claim towards something called the feminist peace are net harmful. So whether or not the data correctly suggests that there is a feminist peace, the claim should neither be made nor emphasized. Third, I make the argument that the liberal progressivist assumptions underlying claims to the feminist peace are themselves gender violent, and therefore problematic for characterizing the feminist peace as either feminist or peaceful. So in the kind of paper underlying this, which is very new, so questions and comments are welcome, I'm interested in exploring what is meant by the feminist peace and then these three arguments. So there are versions and histories of something called the feminist peace. For example, for more than a century, women's peace movements and public policy advocacy organizations made a version of what we call a feminist peace argument. The Institute for Inclusive Security kind of has this on their website, and this is kind of the base of the claim. Women prevent violence and provide security. There's overwhelming evidence that women's empowerment and gender equality are associated with peace and stability. In particular, where women influence decisions about war and peace and take the lead against extremism in their communities, it is more likely crises will be resolved without recourse to violence. Now, you might ask why someone who self-identifies as a feminist and likes the promotion of women's rights would criticize a paragraph like this. And hopefully I'm going to convince you that it is not only possible, but actually necessary to do. So the feminist peace suggests a positive relationship between women and peace. In some way or another, women make peace. These ideas have made their way into policy statements, documents, resolutions, and laws. And recently, quantitatively minded conflict scholars have taken an interest in how essential women are to the creation of international peace and security, looking to demonstrate empirical support for the feminist peace notion that gender equality lessens a state's internal conflict propensity and external conflict propensity and intensity. So the core notion of a feminist peace draws on analogous language from work on the democratic peace or the capitalist peace, or as I said, the McDonald's peace, which hypothesizes that more Pacific state interactions result from progress towards gender equality, including but not limited to increased women's representation in parliaments, empowerment through education, and economic equality. So quantitative studies of the relationship between domestic gender equality and conflict have focused both on intrastate and interstate conflict. Research has contended that there are lower levels of gender equality that lead to the higher likelihood of armed conflict. As one example, Mary Caprioli draws on the work of Johan Galtung to argue that there's structural violence against women through gender hierarchies is created and sustained by cultural hierarchies that tie gender equality to inequality to nationalism and nationalist ideologies to conflict. Gendered nationalism should therefore reinforce structural and cultural violence, thereby increasing the overall likely higher levels of violence in society and in conflict. Caprioli uses two measures of gender equality: the fertility rate, measured dichotomously with 0 being 0 to 3 children and 1 being 3.01 children or higher. We'll leave aside what 0.01 children might look like, and female labor force participation. The supposed theoretical connection between gender equality and interstate conflict finds its roots in the same domestic level processes of structural and cultural violence. Feminist peace scholars often frame gender equality in terms of domestic norms of conflict resolution or institutional constraints on the executive, leveraging, for example, old arguments about the normative and procedural democratic peace. In so doing, the work has sanitized the gendered nature of domestic norms and institutions by focusing on democratic regime types that have made, quote, more progress on gender equality than their autocratic counterparts. So this is one part of the argument. Another part of the argument links it to biological predispositions or socially constructed differences building on biological predispositions and the way that women may lead or make decisions or behave as political actors. So, for example, Valerie Hudson and Andrea Denboer make the argument about a combination of biological and social constructivism to argue that sex selection, which is driven by a preference for sons, leads to distorted sex ratios among some societies, and distorted sex ratios increase the likelihood for violence. Hudson and her colleagues further ground this theory in both evolutionary biology and social psychology and provide some quantitative quote tests of their propositions about the treatment of women within society and their propensity towards peaceful interstate relations. The empirical assessment leverages something called the Woman Stats database. Rather than use extant traditional measures of gender equality and conflict, they create a variety of new indices. The statistical analyses, though exploratory, suggest important relationships. There are a number of newer quantitative studies between the relationship between gender equality and conflict, and a number of those quantitative studies use different measures of gender equality and different measures of conflict. So the results for a lot of these suggest that there is a relationship between gender equality and conflict. But if you look at them, a combination of data measurement issues and problems, degrees of freedom issues, and the ways in which gender and armed conflict are being defined suggest that it might not be as robust as one thinks it is. But this is the basic argument, is that whatever kind of dependent variables are used and whatever intervening variables are used, there's something that is about or causes gender equality, which then either directly or through an intervening variable causes the likelihood to have more peace and less conflict. So I promised you 3 sorts of problems, and I'm going to talk about those now. The first is empirical problems. So overall, the quantitative literature on the feminist piece finds itself more mixed results than one might guess, given how influential it's been in the media and policy worlds. Many articles claim a robust relationship between gender equality and peace, but there are a number of empirical and theoretical reasons to question these internal and external validity of these results. Further, the findings are somewhat more inconsistent when you look at specific indicators, with the percentage of women in parliament being the most robust across a range of dependent variables representing external conflict, but not being at all correlated with any other indicators of gender equality. This is especially striking given that its lack of correlation with any other indicators of gender equality might mean that it talks about or is about something else. So one of the things that I'm interested in is kind of different parts of this critique. One is this question of what gender equality is and what it might mean and how it might be operationalized. It's been operationalized in the literature in a variety of different ways, many of which are related to questions and issues of fertility, women in the workplace, representation in parliament, women's education. It's a combination of survey data and census data that's used. And it's not clear exactly what gender equality would be for theoretical purposes here. Assuming with the literature for a second that the treatment of women is a good proxy for gender equality, a premise that I'm not certain I agree with, it is not to me clear that the measures of that which the literature chooses are the most appropriate measures. The feminist piece literature's measures may be somewhat questionable because the theoretical basis for the choice of these indicators is in liberal feminism. Liberal feminism suggests that the provision of legal standards for equality, combined with looking to provide equal opportunities, will give rise to gender equality. This approach inspires the belief that public material results and outcomes are key, such that achieving suffrage or seats in parliament or jobs in the formal economy are indicative of gender equality. The state of the art in feminist theorizing, on the other hand, suggests that these accounts are both partial and fundamentally wrongly framed, and that these indicators are unlikely to theoretically or empirically co-vary. Which brings me to the second one, which is sex is not gender. Thus far, the literature on the feminist piece has largely treated gender and sex as if they are equivalent concepts. Sex is primarily viewed as biological, while gender is understood as a social construction, though this is often problematized as well. Sex and gender are often conceptually and empirically related, but they do not match perfectly. And gender is often measured by some measure of sex or sex equality, rather than of gender or gender equality. Feminist work in international relations since its inception 30 years ago has made the argument, with the state of the art in gender studies, that the category of woman itself is essentially problematic, that women have nothing either biologically or socially essentially in common, and that both the biological and social worlds are more complicated than a dichotomy between male and female. Instead, feminists have made the argument that gender is a noun, a verb, and an adjective, and that fully understanding its operating in politics requires not only seeing gendered bodies, but also gendered tropes, gendered expectations, and the reflection and production of gendered values in the practice of politics. That part is not easily understood as a part of the feminist peace hypothesis. In fact, much of the feminist peace literature retains more in common with work on women in politics than it does with gender analysis of global politics. While it engages concepts of gender equality, almost all of the literature divides people into women and men as a binary category, as if those categories were to make sense. And most of it uses women's social, economic, and political status to measure gender equality, as if people understood to be men are a baseline, and assuming that people understood to be women are or should be approaching that similarly situated baseline. None of these three logical leaps seem justifiable to me. As such, it's not only a close association between sex and gender that's questionable in this literature, but also the use of sex and sex equality as proxies for gender and gender equality. Measures of women's opportunities and outcomes, either on their own or compared to men, neglects a number of parts of gender-based subordination and abuse that might change not only the intensity of the measures, but also their direction. Some omitted parts of gender subordination might include the negative and positive effects and expectations of assumptions about masculinity on men and boys, the political and economic effects of gender-based violence, the impacts of heteronormativity, homonormativity, homonationalism, and the effects of cissexism. And also, using sex equality as a proxy for gender equality cannot capture the effects of the instrumentalization of gender, both on gender policies and on their results. So then the third empirical problem I have is that there are many dimensions of gender in state politics, not just one dimension where you can measure it as more or less equal. Instead, feminist work has consistently argued that it's necessary to see the gendered insides of states to understand interstate interactions, rather than just whether women are held somehow legally or materially equal to men, in particular social, economic, or political situations. Accordingly, feminist scholars have looked into the gendered nature of states' identities to understand propensities for conflicts, analyzing the gendered constitution of the Westphalian state and its sovereignty, the role of gender in constructing and perpetuating nationalism, and how these gendered identities influence when, where, why, and how states make war. The argument that the states are gendered is not new in IR or in feminist IR. Instead, feminist theorists have demonstrated over and over again the gendered nature of the state and the ways that state decision-making are impacted by not only sex, but also gender in the organization and the assumptions of the state and how it works. I thought I could resist this, but I must go back, turn back on the light in my office, which turns itself off every 15 minutes. So I'm going to go do that, and I will be right back. And apparently you're going to see me do it because I can't turn off my camera in this screen sharing. So
that's okay. Go for it. Sure.
I really thought that it would not annoy me when it happened, but it did. So now I'm back. Okay, so states are gender. That's the third problem. The fourth problem is that women are not necessarily more peaceful than men. So even if gender equality were easy to define and sex were a proxy for gender, and there's a clear causal chain between gender equality and peace, I'm troubled by the key assumption often found in the feminist peace literature, that the proposition that women or women's values or femininity can be associated with peace and men and men's values or masculinity can be associated with violence. This is itself sex essentialism that has long been perpetuated in popular discourses as well as academic and policy analysis of gender war and conflict. Certainly, values associated with femininity may be more associated with peace, but that doesn't make women or any women who may be held equal by a state more or less peaceful. In fact, feminist scholarship in international security suggests that women are not inherently more peaceful than men, and that the women's engagement in political violence is often less visible or less recognized as agential. That doesn't mean it's insignificant or does not exist. Women themselves are frequently advocates of political violence and actors in political violence. And the idea that women are themselves less capable or less likely to commit political violence does not hold women equal to men. Instead, it holds women to a higher standard than men because it suggests that they might be equal to men without men's flaws. Some scholars argue that it is not women themselves, but women's positionality that makes them more have the larger propensity to peacefulness. Putting aside for a second that the empirical evidence that women are more peaceful is scant to non-existent, this argument, perhaps unintentionally but nonetheless problematically, suggests the desirability of social subordination, right? Because it suggests that women are more peaceful because women are in a subordinated position, and women being more peaceful is socially desirable, which means that women being in a socially subordinated situation is desirable, which is, in my view, normatively problematic. Also, the argument insufficiently grapples with the idea that states rationalize their conflictual actions by claiming that they were treating women well by protecting their own women from enemies or by intervening states' treatment of in other states' treatment of their women. In other words, it has several gender essentialist and therefore gender subordinating ideas to say that women are more peaceful, even when you mean that positively. Okay, so those are some empirical problems. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about how the causal chain also doesn't necessarily work, right? So when I said to you that these hypotheses share that something or other causes more gender equality, which either directly or through an intervening variable causes peace, it's not at all clear to me that there is a causal mechanism other than understanding that women might be more peaceful. And of course, this is the criticism of a lot of dyadic theories of war, where the question of how you get from this particular characteristic of a state or a group of people to the likelihood to make more war or make more peace is less obvious than a statistical correlation that you can find. And I want to argue here that I don't know the variables that started out about causing more gender equality, and then I don't know the intervening variables between gender equality and peace. And anything I can associate there doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So this is because kind of overwhelmingly there are a few things here that monadic peace theories are otherwise not a thing. So if you read the gender equality peace literature or the feminist peace literature, it's almost all the traits of one state, which is not how any of the other literatures on the propensity to conflict really work, which require the traits of two states. So that's a problem. And then the kind of last related problem is problems of data limitations. So there's a lot of questions in and around the possibility of finding good data on gender equality and how it is or is not related to whatever the data is on armed conflict. Particularly, a lot of the data in gender equality is either missing or measured in a questionable way or measured in a number of different directions, such that you're not entirely certain what you're getting when you use either an individual indicator or a composite indicator. So this is kind of like a big boring list of some of the empirical problems. And the last couple are reverse causality. So it may actually be peace that causes gender equality instead of gender equality that causes peace. And you would get the same empirical results because none of them are time lagged. And it may actually be that gender equality and peace are themselves constitutive factors of another kind or another situation, which also isn't kind of taken account of by the literature. It could also be a spurious correlation, where there's actually nothing that these two things have in common except they happen to correlate. And none of these things are particularly eliminated by the feminist peace literature. And then there are kind of some far-fetched arguments around what this causal chain might be, including but not limited to divine intervention and evolutionary biology, which I'm happy to talk about more in the Q&A. But I'm just going to kind of leave them here for now. So I also think that there are some pretty serious political problems, even if we were to take that the empirical work on the sex equality piece is a thing and makes a case for the sex equality piece. So one political problem that I have with it is that it reifies traditional notions of what international security is and what state violence is and what it means to be secure. Particularly, I think that it's important to note that the definition of peacefulness remains related to and about interstate war rather than related to or about kind of some of the more human security things that feminists and other critical security scholars have suggested are crucially important about the ways in which we think about security, insecurity, war, and peace. So we're keeping this notion that war is the opposite of peace, and that when there's not a war, there is peace, and that's kind of how we understand the questions of violence. So I think that when you think about it, it's important to know that there's not directly or even closely indirectly kind of an understanding of what counts as or constitutes or can be understood as this war-peace dichotomy. And then we can kind of think from there about the problems of reifying traditional notions of security and the ways in which those reifications end up causing significant problems for the ways that we think about not only peace, but also how that relates to sex and gender. So then another problem is what I mentioned earlier, which is instrumentalization. So when I say instrumentalization, what I mean is that there's a problem where you advocate for something because it's good for something else rather than because it's good. So essentially, when you say that we should have more gender equality because gender equality makes peace, then I think that it's something that means that gender equality's value is tied to its ability to make peace, and the value of gender equality would somehow decrease both politically and socially if it was unable to, unwilling to, or not even for the purpose of making peace. So, for example, shortly after the election of Donald Trump as president of the United States, the New York Times published an op-ed entitled "Women's Rights as a National Security Issue," which was by Valerie Hudson and Dara K. Cohen. The contribution explains that women's rights are directly tied to national security, such that the State Department's gender equality programs are not just politically correct fluff. Instead, they deal with matters of life and death. Hudson and Cohen list some of these matters, which include physical danger to women and the abuses that they may suffer. But then they reference the feminist peace hypothesis as if it is a fact. Over a decade's worth of research shows that women's advancement is critical to stability and reducing violence, such that countries where women are empowered are vastly more secure. The references to this op-ed are to work that's kind of using some of this feminist peace work, and it's not isolated. And so my problem is that then gender equality programs as politically correct fluff, quote unquote, would be discredited, and gender equality programs as a measure of national security then become important. So you might ask, what harm does it do for the New York Times to publish an op-ed that says that gender equality is good, and in fact, that these are issues of life and death? Even if the association is inaccurate, right? Its heart is in the right place. All of these popular outlets are promoting both women's equality and peace, which are both good things, right? So what am I whining about? While this publicity that the feminist piece receives appears to be all good, a closer look suggests that it promotes gender equality for national security, which politicizes the nature and naturalization of politics, reifies traditional notions of security, instrumentalizes women and gender, and has this possibility for the weaponization of the feminist piece. And I think all of those things are fairly deeply problematic in terms of how we think and talk about gender equality and its relationship to and about peace. Particularly, it's not only the framework of women's security as national security that reifies both traditional gender categories and traditional notions of security. It's also that it instrumentalizes those categories in service of traditional notions of national security. Women, women's rights, and women's lives are therefore need to be improved, but improved in service of and subordinate to the security needs of the state. This means that women are useful in so much, and only in so much, as their welfare provides security. Evidence against the link between women's rights and peace, for example, could then be leveraged to dampen arguments for the promotion of gender equality. Instrumentalization causes, among other problems, an enforcement problems. If these policies are adopted for women to make their lives better, then they would be enforced to the extent that they make women's lives better. If they're adopted for security instead of for women, then you have a different kind of level of enforcement and a level of interest in enforcement that is important to pay attention to. So then third, and kind of for me, one of the most important things is this problem that instrumentalization can lead to weaponization. So instrumentalization doesn't only make the status of women vulnerable to the thing that it's instrumentalized for, it also makes it subject to weaponization. So stories about the weaponization of the democratic peace have become so commonplace in the halls of the IR literature that we now understand that democratic states used it to argue for and force democratization before finding out or ignoring the brutality of democratization at the peril of literally millions of lives. So gender in service of security has been weaponized as well, and I argue with potentially devastating results. For example, Hillary Clinton's speech about being on the right side of history in terms of gender and LGBTQ rights demonstrates that the pursuit of gender equality can be used as a point of distinction between those understood as us and those understood as them in whatever terms of political party or nation belligerent, where the othering of them is a condition of possibility of violence. This can be seen in Valerie Hudson and her co-author's book, Sex and World Peace, where gender equality data is leveraged, I believe misleadingly, to make implications about the presumed negative influence of Islam on the quality of societies in general, including propensities for gender inequality and bellicosity. In other words, the good guys treat their women and their queers right and have less wars. And therefore, it is acceptable and in fact encouraged to impose values about gender on others and to make the bad guys treat their women and their queers better and make less wars. Gender rights then can become another axis of potentially violent international confrontation and international interference. Along these lines, states and international institutions may be interested in gender rights as justifying particular military objectives or a way to gain relative physical or social capital over an adversary. For example, interrogating the United States government's interest in women's rights in Afghanistan, which was one of many claimed motives for the United States invasion. The concern is that the Bush administration not only was not actually committed to women's rights, but had cynically used this rhetoric to increase support for its foreign policy and to win re-election by appealing to women voters, which is Michelle Ferguson's view. So often even liberal countries weaponize apparently gender emancipatory positions and policies to gain popularity or a sense of moral superiority, rather than for the women who the policies are in theory about. Indeed, this was most recently captured by the phrase feminism as counterterrorism, which is made legible and legitimate sans an analysis of the political context in which it emerged and the policies it sanctions. sporadic references to women then in counterterrorism policies have a legitimacy function for subsequent policies where there is a deep problem both in terms of counterterrorism and in terms of women and women's rights. In fact, they can result in increased risk and increased insecurity to women who in the discourse of counterterrorism appear solely as wives and mothers. These are among the perverse results of instrumentalized and essentialist accounts of gender being weaponized for the purposes of thinking and talking about security. This weaponization is within and reifies existing subordinating gender orders, even as it weaponizes ideas that appear to transgress those orders. A gender order is a political order structured by and using gender hierarchies. Women are not disadvantaged to men in almost all areas of local and global social political life because they are women per se, or because of something inherent about women that makes them different than or less capable than men. Instead, women are disadvantaged to men because women are associated with femininity, because femininity is devalued politically, socially, economically, and globally. Weaponizations of valuing femininity or the rights of women then serve to reify the subordinating status of those claims, even while claiming to elevate women and gender equality. So that's a complicated circle, but I promise that it makes theoretical sense. So then there are kind of also ontological issues, which is the third and final category that I wanted to talk a little bit about. So essentially, even aside from specific empirical and political problems with the feminist piece as such, it's important to see that claims to the feminist piece, along with other liberal progressivist rights-based claims, share a problematic gender-violent underlying assumption that often goes unrecognized. The feminist piece is part of and a reification of the trend of announcing the continued and continuing successes of Western liberal democracy as the ultimate way of improving people's lives. An announcement woven so tightly and repeated so frequently and told so emotionally that it often seems to and feels true, both to people individually and in collective consciousness, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Even as Western liberal democracy touts the rights of the other, here women, and claims to be bestowing those rights as a constitutive act of its superiority, alongside those claims are terrible violences. How can current political orders be manifestly and violently exclusive when there are so many claims to inclusivity? And improved inclusivity is announced frequently and with fanfare. Doesn't the feminist piece make this better and not worse? The new inclusion of various minorities in states' benefits and the state's new identity as a protector of minorities is in fact not new at all. Instead, states discipline by inclusion. They punish continued deviation outside of that inclusion, and they use their inclusiveness to critique their enemies, defined by their exclusiveness while excluding them, which I realized was a whole bunch of kind of pathways, but I hope that makes sense. In this view, then, with many counterparts, the humanity and inclusiveness to the claim of women's rights of national security is a lie. It's one built by and built into liberal democracy as an institution, which disguises the endemic violences in its structures that, in Mbembe's words, the brutality of democracies is swept under the carpet amidst right claims, which suggests that modern democracy has two faces, solar and the nocturnal. The solar side is the one that those who endorse the feminist piece see and show, one of rights, inclusion, and progressive betterment without zero-sum gains. The solar side, however, Mbembe warns, foreshadows the nocturnal side, one constituted by fear and destruction of the constitutive other, as the threat from the outside. The nocturnal side includes colonial empires, pro-slavery states, and the abuse of both internal and external outsiders. As such, civil peace in the West depends in large part on inflicting violence far away, institutionalizing a regime of inequality on a global scale, including but not limited to colonial and slave systems, gender inequality, and other measures of subordination. This makes, for example, democracy plantation, and colonial empire, in Mbembe's words, part of the same historical matrix, democracy's violences then are not incidental or erasable, but structural. They're not the opposite of liberal democracy's peace, but they are built into it. They're not short-term, but long-term. They're not problems to be fixed within democracy, but they're problems of democracy. Fundamentally, democracies have always been societies of separation, depending on leaving some outside, whether those people are actually outside or inside. The unfreedom of being included in this term, the unfreedom of being the women on whom rights are bestowed in order to have national security, is also something that thinkers have thought a lot about. Particularly, I'm thinking about Wendy Brown's argument, where liberal democracy aims to count every difference as no difference, but also to count every possible subversive rejection of culturally enforced norms as themselves normal, normalizable, and normalizable through law. In other words, when people's behavior falls outside of a given norm, that norm is re-examined, recodified, re-legislated, and renormalized so that it can be controlled, owned, and included, regardless of the desire of the people or the nature of the people in exhibiting the behavior for inclusion or normalization. In other words, inclusion and the bestowal of rights is itself an act of violence, which cannot be accounted for and indeed makes impossible a notion of the feminist peace. So given all of these issues, oops, apparently the last slide does not exist. Well, all right, let me give you this cute slide, and I will tell you about what the last slide should say. I'm not sure how it didn't end up there. But here's the kind of overarching conclusion. The feminist peace hypothesis matters. It matters in the public eye and in public policy. It gets coverage in public outlets. And therefore, analyzing how it matters. That was great, wasn't it? Okay, so returning to the title of this paper and the idea of this talk, I want to tell you about why pessimism about this is an important emphasis. There's this optimism all around. Optimism about women and gendered rights, but also optimism about what other good stuff we will get out of this rights. Whether it is the feminist peace or the decline of violence hypothesis, we are promised that the world has become a better place because we have started treating our women better. The combination of continued improvement and evangelism will continue to pay off. We see parallel optimism in the academic study of gender, gender-friendly policies being somewhat sometimes unreflectively celebrated, weak statistical findings being glossed over or even excused, giving their promising direction, and a general sense of hope about the existing and future diffusion of norms of gender equality. Like good states, good academics can celebrate progressive research agendas. Pessimism here, then, is not only an orientation to what I see as the evidentiary political and ontological problems with those optimisms, but it's also a politics. The evidentiary problems are substantive and methodological. The political problems are instrumentalization and weaponization. And the ontological problems are the situation in partial understanding of who benefits from global governance. My pessimistic approach is at first meant to highlight those, but it's also meant to do more. It's meant to aim at both personal and collective responsibility for the violences of our scholarly claims. What we write, how we write it, can cause even inadvertent harm, even and perhaps especially when it is well-intentioned. The violences of inclusion and instrumentalization can be so much harder to see than the violences that these tools are often wielded to combat, but they are no less real, no less painful, and no less problematic, substantively or normatively. Here, a politics of pessimism finds a veritable mess of baggage. In addition to the theoretical and empirical problems, it suggests that the very things we think might be helping both women and peace are harming the former and propping up the oppressive regime of the latter. It is then my view that it's not enough to reject the empirics of the feminist peace, but the gender violent politics and the gender violent ontologies which make this statement and the hypothesis and work possible. In such a quest, time is of the essence in a very different way than the feminist peace claims it might be. While feminist peace claims either cite an emergency of the possibility of a reverse of the global trends of gender equality or the need to capitalize on existing momentum. when I think of this times of crisis, I'm not referring to either of those supposed trends. Instead, I'm referring to the rising salience of the feminist piece and cognate discourses as the crisis, one which is unrecognized and perhaps even unrecognizable and often unspeakable in an atmosphere of optimism paired with the politics of progressivism. Pessimistically, I look to interrupt both of those atmospheres with a message of the direness of our optimisms. Okay, I think that that's it for me for now, and I'm happy to take questions and have a conversation.
Super. Thank you, Laura, for that provocative and insightful presentation. Just to clarify, I'm not Sandy Monteverde. I apologize to the audience. Been having some technical issues. It is what it is. I'll be honest, I was interrupted, wasn't able to hear the whole thing. So I know Muge, you've been here and able to listen. So could I I don't know if you have a first question you wanted to ask Muge before we try to moderate a little bit.
Sure, I do. Laura, thank you so much. You've given us plenty to think about, and definitely very, very important subjects for all of us, whether we're doing gender, whether we're doing IR. So this is a great intersection. Thank you very much for this talk. I have a question, and one of our colleagues, Julia Santucci, posed a question. So if it's okay, Michael, I'll start with my bit, and then mine is rather quick, and I kind of have a sense of the answer that I'm going to get for you, but I want to put it out there regardless. Laura, I wanted to ask you whether your pessimism extends itself to feminist foreign policy, the conceptualization and application of it, in the sense that, you know, we hear feminist foreign policy kind of wants to step outside the black box of approaching traditional foreign policy thinking, and its focus on military force violence and domination, by offering an alternative and intersectional rethinking of security from the viewpoint of the most vulnerable. So I wanted to see whether your thoughts of feminist foreign policy is equally pessimistic.
I really enjoy this pessimistic moment, so I'm going to say yes, but I'm going to give a couple of caveats. I'm not a feminist foreign policy expert. I do think that there's a lot of instrumentalization in feminist foreign policy, and strangely enough, you know, we kind of have this state feminism literature from the 90s that we're not learning the lessons of when we're analyzing feminist foreign policy now, right? So I think that matters. So I'm not suggesting that overall it's a naughty thing, but it does seem to me like it is also kind of biting some of these problems with instrumentalization and the legitimation of particular issues. And I'm also concerned that, I don't know if you remember, like maybe 20 years ago, this good international citizens movement of kind of middle power states. It reminds me a little bit of that, but now being a good international citizen is being a good feminist, right? So yeah, I have a cynical pessimism about feminist foreign policy, particularly in terms of this what will become of it as different governments take over some of these places that started it, right? So like the Swedish elections, for example, feminist foreign policy won't go away, but I don't know what it will be now. And it's not going to be what it was before. At least I don't think so. Not an expert on Swedish politics either. But to me, that's another concern, is now this buzzword gets to hang out with governments regardless of what they mean by it, which may be kind of even more instrumental and more problematic than the liberal governments that originally endorsed and came up with the idea, right?
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I think this is a really good segue, because our colleague Julia Santucci's question is about instrumentalization. And she asks, regarding the instrumentalization point, all foreign policies and programs are framed in terms of national security. The United States does not spend money or diplomatic time on issues we don't think relate to our national security. So if feminist peace scholars and policymakers don't make arguments for promoting gender equality globally in terms of how it relates to advancing national security, then in all likelihood, the United States would not spend time or money on advancing gender equality globally. In your view, would that be a better outcome? Are we, quote unquote, the United States doing more harm by advancing gender equality in a national security framework than by not working to advance it at all?
Okay, so I'll first say that I live in the ivory tower and I like to live in the ivory tower and I'm going to stay here. But I will also say, I think the answer to that question is absolutely yes, it's more harm than good. It's partly more harm than good, because if you look at the United States planning about gender equality, it is almost entirely external. So, for example, United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 and its subsequent resolutions on women, peace, and security ask for national action plans on what states will do about gender and security. The United States has had several of them. Across those several national action plans, there have been, I think, almost 1,000 pages of national action plan about women, peace, and security. And in those 1,000 pages, there has not been a single thing about any woman within the United States. So it has all been preaching gender equality outside because we've got gender equality solved in the United States, apparently. And so in some sense, you're evangelizing something that you're actually awful at. Which I think is deeply problematic, although not un-American in a lot of ways, right? So to me, yes, because it takes as an assumption that gender equality in the US is fine. It takes as an assumption that the US's view of gender equality is universal and universalizable. And it also takes as an assumption that the ways that the United States exports its values are productive and useful. And to me, none of those assumptions resonate at all. So I think that the more productive effort is to say that the national security system in itself is deeply gender subordinating, and weaponizes gender subordination itself in both gender and racially subordinating ways. So to me, standing outside of this system instead of playing into it is significantly less violent. But I say that as someone who has a paycheck that comes from the ability to stand outside the system. And I think that in theory, there need to be all sorts of people playing all sorts of different roles in this. But I do think that the instrumentalization part is something that I'm not sure I've ever bought the strategic essentialism argument as such. And even if you did buy it as such, I'm really worried that in this particular context, that constitutes a particular kind of flattening and militarization of women's rights, that then you see things like, there was a speech that G.W. Bush gave to West Point in the 2002 graduation, leading up to the war in Iraq, about like all the reasons that there should be a war in Iraq. And one of them was that violence against women and children is always and everywhere wrong, and America will fight evil, right? So at that point, it wasn't just trying to evangelize women's rights. It was that they will be militarily enforced. And we all know that wasn't the reason. And we all know that they weren't going to be militarily enforced. But it matters that the logic of the military enforcement of women's rights sold. And that to me seems deeply problematic, right? It sounds like the democratization argument from the Democratic piece.
Could I follow up on that, Muge? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. That helps me understand where you're coming from more. But as you said, you and I'll put myself in that boat as well, Laura. I mean, we are somewhat privileged in the sense that we work in the academy, and so we have the privilege of being able to have the time and energy to do our reading, to think about these issues, to do our writing. And it's perfectly fine if you want to run back and turn that on. I can pause my question if you want to do that, because I'm not sure you can hear me if I There we go. Okay, but not everyone has that luxury, right? Some people do live in the policy world, and actually GISPIA is a policy school. And so our students are not training to necessarily go on to be, get a PhD and enter academia or do whatever else they might do, but they want to work in the policy world. So what would you tell someone like that who is sensitive to the concerns that you raise and is sensitive to the way that sex and gender are so easily weaponized in policy discourse, but also, sees actually, no, within the US, we do have a long way to go in terms of gender equality, and we also have a long way to go internationally, but I still want to help. What would you say to someone like that?
I think that there are a couple of layers of this that maybe I'll kind of play with. The first is that I think it's almost always possible to listen to other people's perspectives instead of acting on your own. And when you listen to other people's perspectives, I think you find significantly more information about what may be desirable and what may be undesirable than you do when you're kind of deciding that everybody might feel about these things like me and my friends feel about these things, or like me and my fellow Americans feel about these things, right? So like not assuming particular values are universal, I think goes a very long way. I think also there's incremental change one can have by not participating in the worst of it, right? By not participating in, for example, my country is better than your country because we're good at this and you're bad at this sort of discourse, which I don't think you have to participate in the policy world. I think accepting incremental change is something that's really important. So I guess I'll tell you that I have a lesson, and I think that I'll give you the story and then I'll give you the lesson. So 6 years ago now, Reed Wood and I were asked by a project sponsored by USAID to write a report on why women from the Middle East, North Africa joined the Islamic State. And it was kind of at the height of the Islamic State at the time and stuff like that. And it was FHI 360 working for USAID and Mercy Corps working for FHI 360 and us working for Mercy Corps, which suggests that the private development corporation world is alive and well. But in doing this, we were to write this report. And so to me, this is one of the most frustrating experiences of my professional life. In part because women from that area at that time did not join the Islamic State. That is, there weren't really any of them. And then also in part because we figured out that what they wanted was something that said that women join the Islamic State because they're poor, so they need microloans. So if we give women microloans, we will enhance national security. Right. And so that's the story they wanted. And from what we can tell, not only is that story not the case, probably if you give people more money, they would be more likely. But that doesn't actually make microloans a bad idea. It just makes them not in service of a particular US national security goal. But so we wrote a really, really long report. And I'm not supposed to talk about what gets classified and what doesn't, but I can tell you what was published was a page and a half. And it was called People Not Pawns. And it made the argument that the people who join the Islamic State, particularly the women who join the Islamic State, have a multitude of complex reasons instead of a group of simple ones. And to me, that was like, I cannot believe I put all that work into this like little watered down statement. And then about a year ago, I read a book about gender and US counterterrorism policy, which suggested that that was a watershed in AID approaches to terrorism, because it was the first time that women's agency was explicitly discussed. So this thing that I thought was like frustrating and conservative and only a little part of what I wanted to do, and like, constrained in all sorts of ways, apparently made someone else think that it opened up a lot of space, right? So sometimes you are stuck in the context and you can't see that the incremental thing actually did matter. And here the refusal to sensationalize women's violence mattered, even if it kind of was frustrating in a particular policy hole, right? So it's actually not that you have to accomplish it all at once. Like little parts of it can happen too. But I think the part of it that I want to advocate, like you can accomplish it once, is you can stop asserting superiority on the basis of perceived views on gender and sexuality. So you can stop saying, I'm better than you because I'm better at gender equality. And I think that that would probably go a long way in not just the academic, but also the policy worlds.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Yeah, that makes sense. Muge?
Sure. We have another question from one of our colleagues, Luke Kandra. So I'll go ahead and read his question. Luke says, I'm curious about the conclusion to your empirical dimension of your critique of the feminist piece. It could seem to me that the issues you raise about some of the results in this quantitative literature, omitted variable bias, endogeneity, data quality, might be read as indeterminate on the question rather than as disinformation. That is, those issues arguably call for adoption of empirical approaches than to avoid or mitigate those issues and provide better test of the hypotheses, for example, natural experiments. I guess I'm wondering why you interpret arguably problematic results as evidence that the hypothesis is wrong, or maybe I'm misunderstanding your argument. Thanks, Luke.
Let's play choose your own adventure in answer to this question. Okay, so my inner radical post-structuralist says you cannot measure gender. You cannot measure gender equality. And doing so is itself incredibly fraught and not possible and a whole big mess. But taking that you don't buy that, I think that I have a couple of answers. So the first is that I'm not entirely sure that the natural experiments necessarily lend themselves to solving this problem either. The second is I'm trying to be polite about how bad this data is and how bad the results are and how poorly it is done. And at sometimes they're completely unreplicable. And sometimes you can replicate them, but somebody literally took a pencil eraser to a coefficient. Sometimes you have an N of 105 with 11 variables. So this is stuff that you wouldn't get away with in a conclusion to an intro freshman statistics class, right? And if you make a data set that is really big and full of different cases and full of different indicators, so we put together a data set where the largest N I've seen on these questions is about 700. And we put together a data set that's about 17,000. And in that data set with 29 indicators of what gender equality might be and all sorts of different kind of independent and dependent variables, we've found really no correlation, with the exception of a correlation between higher levels of teen pregnancy and lower levels of conflict, which is a very small marginal effect, although it's not a statistical significance. So we found a way to get rid of. So we can lag it, we can time delay it, we can log it. There's really we can control for capitalism and development. We can kind of send it both ways in time. There's not really, can't get rid of it, but it is significant, but a very small marginal effect. And that's the only thing in terms of traditional understandings of MIDS and interstate wars that you can find that's significant. If you go over to the alliance data, then you can find gender equality as correlated with alliance building. And that correlation is pretty strong, but that's a completely different argument than interstate or interstate conflict. So essentially, like, if you do it better, and I say better because I don't think we're doing it right, but if you do it better, then the correlation goes away in our experience. But this is not something we have published, and perhaps controversially, it will not be something that I think we publish. So I'm happy to talk about why if you care. But that's kind of my view of things, is that I've played with it enough that I don't think the correlation holds when you do the work kind of with a little bit more quote unquote statistical rigor.
Well, then let me ask the natural follow-up to that. It sounds like that piece would be an important contribution. So why not let it see the light of publication?
Well, what are the politics of that? Right?
I see. Yeah.
So like, to me, this is a fraught question, right? Because like, if you openly attempt to discredit the feminist piece, this nuanced argument I make about like 6 steps that are a problem about it, right, is not going to be the thing that makes it, right? It's going to be, there is no feminist piece, so we don't need gender equality to do the instrumental work of feminist piece, so we don't need gender equality anymore. So like, to me, my concern is that however problematic the feminist piece is, the work of discrediting it does not do the work of undoing the problem of the feminist piece. So like, I like to talk about it, but I don't think I particularly like to write about it.
You don't necessarily want to make it worse.
Yeah. And I don't know a way not to make it worse.
Yeah.
Once I find that, we'll publish everything and it'll be fine. But I haven't found it yet, and it's been, 15 years, so I'm not optimistic.
Yep. No, okay, that helps me understand your thinking. Absolutely. Okay, I can see that our colleague Muge needs to step away. And there's no more questions, and I don't want to, keep people just for the sake of having on. I think that this has been a very insightful discussion. This really illustrates the whole point of this series, which is to bring in people with diverse viewpoints so that we can learn from it. So I think, Laura, you've done a fantastic job with that this afternoon. I want to thank you. This has been very interesting discussion for me, speaking for me personally. So I'm so happy that we were able to bring you in and to host you. And what I didn't say at the beginning is that I've known you for quite some time. I first met Laura when she was still a PhD candidate at the University of Southern California, working under her mentor, Ann Tickner, who is one of the
21 years ago, right?
Yeah, about 21 years ago or so. So it's so good to see you, and it's so wonderful to follow your career trajectory since then, and so impressive everything that you've been able to accomplish. And so thank you for taking the time to meet with us today and to share your insights. And I want to thank our audience for taking their time to join us today. And I want to apologize for the technical difficulties on my end, but it is what it is, and we're all doing the best we can. So I have nothing more on my end. Laura, I don't know if you want to conclude with anything, but turn it back over to you.
Well, I think I just wanted to thank you for having me. And likewise, it's been cool to watch your awesome career and the things that you're doing at Pitt and things like that. And if anybody's interested in staying in touch, I'm happy to stay in touch.
Thank you. Thank you. Absolutely. We'll be sure to do that. So great to see you. And I look forward to the next time our paths cross, hopefully sooner rather than later. Thank you again to our audience, wishing everybody an enjoyable rest of your day. And thank you for joining us. We'll see you later. Take care.